We all set?
All set.
Okay, I'm Phil Merletti, and if you see my picture in the post office, I'm wanted. I'm wanted by the criminals, I'm wanted by the communists, I'm wanted by the Democrats and the socialists and the progressives. So I'm wanted. My wife wants me too. But I want to thank you guys for being here today. It's holiday season. I didn't expect very many people to be here anyway, except for those who are really dedicated to this issue. But the one thing that I have found is even people who are dedicated to the issue, and they know that the most important things today in politics is the U.S. Constitution and the Maine Constitution. And even though that these people know this, I ask them, have you read it? Oh yeah. Have you studied it? No. Do you know how to use it? No. So my suggestion to you is knowledge doesn't do a damn good for you unless you use that knowledge. And where do you use that knowledge? You use that knowledge in your hometown, because this is where the power comes from, is in your hometown. Then that power goes to the county. And once you learn how to work within your county, then the power goes to the state legislature, and then eventually to where the real swamp is in Washington. So having knowledge doesn't do anything for you until you learn how to use it and where to use it. So where do you get this knowledge? It's from these two things here, the state constitution and the U.S. Constitution. Now I love to go through the halls of Augusta, and I see some of these legislators there, and what do they have in their pocket? And I say, hey, you guys read the Constitution? Do you guys know the Constitution? And they say, oh yeah, look. And I say, oh, great, nothing's underlined. There's nothing dog-eared here. When's the last time you read it? Do you know anything about this? All they do is walk around like this so that people like you or I would want to go up to them and challenge them. But see, when they don't use it, it's not worth a darn. That's the Constitution right there. You go through it, you find dog ears, you find underlines, you find things that are highlighted. That's a legislature if you find this in here. Okay? But what can this Constitution do for you? You could have all the knowledge in the world of this, and this is really nice to have, because this is what started this. Without this, there isn't this. If you have your Constitution there, go to your 10th Amendment. It's that 10th Amendment that gives the states to have power over this. Now in the halls of the legislature in Maine, you can't use this to make laws. How do you make laws? This is the one you use to make laws. It's the state constitution. This doesn't help you at all until you learn that the 10th Amendment, sure. Now, how do the criminals get away with things in Washington is that you don't know this. How do the criminals get away with the things that they do in Augusta is you don't know this. So who should really know the Constitution? The legislators or you? Both of you. Because without you knowing this, you don't know what the heck they're doing. So that's my message to you today is get this. And if you don't have this particular one in blue, the Secretary of State will not give me these anymore. Because I go to meetings like this and I pass them out. I think Bob got my last, where's Bob? I think Bob got my last 10. I got a few left. Anyway, why am I here today? To kind of discuss some of the Constitution. It's the oath. Now I always tell people, if you're going to study the Bible, what do you have to do? You have to study the time when it was created. You need to know the language, you need to know the politics, you need to know where the frame of mind where the people were at that time. So how do you study this? Is you have to go back and study that era. You have to go back to figure out what the reasons why this was created. You have to understand the language. And that's the only way you're going to understand that, is put yourself in that frame of mind of who the people were, what the people were. These wonderful people who created the federal Constitution and the state Constitution came up with a qualifier that would identify what type of person would be a legislator. I'm going to hand these out for you, please. You want to have people with principles. How many legislators today know anything about principles? Whether they be a federal legislator or a federal congressperson or a state legislator, they don't understand principles. I showed these to a lot of the legislators, and I don't like to embarrass a legislator, but I asked them to read that and say, can you kind of read this and see if you fit any of these qualifications or principles? So back then when they created the Constitution, they thought that people who would run for any type of legislative seat or any type of important seat within government, whether it be federal or state, would have principles. Well, today we know they don't. But I always like to hand them out to the legislators and see if they wouldn't read these and maybe change their ways of doing business. I'm here today to speak about the oath. Why? Because I believe it's the most important thing that a legislator can do, is to give that oath. And the reason why I say to look back into history as to where these people are coming from is back then, the oath, you did not violate the oath. Once you gave your word, whether it had been a handshake or a blink of an eye or a raised eyebrow or a pat on the back, once you made a promise, that was it. That was your word. That was your worth. So what was the very first thing that our U.S. Officers created as far as statutes go? What was it based on? The oath. Statute 1, Chapter 1, Sections 1 through 4. Did you already get this one? I don't know if I have enough there.
Okay.
But the statutes that are created do nothing but define and create value for the Constitution. It explains what the Constitution is and what it promises to do for the people. Statute 1, Chapter 1, Section 1 explain who would take the oath. And if you get down to number 3, it explains that the states all have to take the oath too. So before you become a legislator or any kind of public servant, you've got to take that oath. If you go over to Section 4, you'll see in the highlighted areas, very clearly shows that if you don't take the oath, they're going to penalize you. That's how important the oath is, because your word is valued. Today, I asked the legislators if they've taken an oath, and of course I go to see that ceremony that they take, and that's all they look at is that it's a ceremony. But once they give that oath, you will support the Constitution. Oh, I got it. Right to where I put it. Okay. Do we have another one around that I haven't used yet? Okay, if you notice that the oath is broken into 2 different parts. And both of those parts of the oath, you swear before the eyes of God. These were very religious people back then. They knew where the rights came from. Well, I got a Constitution here. I just couldn't find it quick enough. If you'll give me the time to catch up on it. I picked up the wrong one. I'm going to steal the one from you back again.
You want mine here? I got Bob's got one.
I need the oath. Did I hand the oath out? I thought I handed that out.
No, this is what you handed out, right here. This,
Okay.
Phil, right here?
No, those
This-
are principles.
Yeah.
Give me a second to find it. I grabbed the wrong one today because I had a dog ear. Okay, here we go. My eyesight gets worse every year. Every person elected or appointed to either of the places or offices provided in this Constitution, and every person elected, appointed, or commissioned to any judicial, executive, military, or other offices under this state shall, before entering on the discharge of the duties of what place or office, take and subscribe the following oath or affirmation. They're saying, before you get a chance to do your work, you got to take that oath. Met with the Secretary of State, and I said to him, what if someone doesn't read the Constitution before they take that oath? Are they in fraud? Or what if they don't read the Constitution and understand it after they take the oath and they start doing business in the halls of Augusta? Are they in fraud? Which time are they in fraud, before or after? And the Secretary of State did not have an answer to that. Because once you've given that oath that you're going to support the Constitution before you go to work, it's fraud. And I spoke with a person down in Bangor who teaches a class on fraud, and he says, you won't get me to admit to that, but he says, you're 100% right. He said, I won't admit to that to anybody else, or I won't sign a piece of paper, but he says, they are all in fraud if they have not learned the Constitution. So think about that. Our legislators are in fraud. Now again, it says, I, whoever that person is, do swear that I will support the Constitution of the United States, which is this one here, and of this state, so long as I shall continue a citizen thereof, so help me God. That doesn't mean once he gets out of the office that he could forget about supporting the Constitution. So once you're a legislator and you've given this oath, until you die, or unless you move out of the state of Maine, it's your job to support this Constitution. A lot of legislators don't understand that. So a lot of them get out of office and they're still in politics. If they don't support the Constitution while they're helping out their political party, if they don't understand this, they're in fraud. Then it goes on to say, the second part of it, I do swear that I will faithfully discharge to the best of my abilities. Well, they can kind of get away and say, geez, I did that to the best of my ability, but did they really? Goes on to say, I will, to the best of my abilities, the duties incumbent on me as whatever position they're in, according to the Constitution and the laws of the state, so help me God. Second time they said, so help me God. So when they violate this, who are they really violating? Think about that. Okay, how did they put that Maine Constitution together? Is the people who were responsible for doing the U.S. Constitution came to Maine and helped create that second Constitution. U.S. Constitution was ratified in 1789. The Maine Constitution was created in 1719. I'm sorry, give me a second here. 1819, and it was ratified in 1820. John Adams was very instrumental in creating a lot of this language here. And I can't remember the other founding fathers that came into Maine to help them out. But what they did was they took the Declaration of Independence and they took the 10 amendments and they incorporated it into the Constitution. So whereas the federal Constitution doesn't have, maybe it might be written in here, but it isn't the Constitution. It is separate. You have the Bill of Rights, and you have the Constitution itself and the Declaration of Independence, all three of them. Well, they put them together and made the U.S. or made the Maine Constitution. And I'm glad you mentioned that the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution isn't as strong as the Maine Constitution is. Whereas the U.S. Constitution says that you won't interfere with the people's rights, the Maine Constitution says you're not going to question it. Mm-hmm. And that's your difference there. The other thing is, when you were explaining the militia, the Second Amendment has a comma in that sentence where it talks about the militia. That second part of the sentence talks about the people's individual rights. And this is where the argument begins with a lot of the leftists, where they say, oh, that's only for the militia. No, if you know anything about English, there's a comma there, and it gives the people the right to carry firearms other than the militia. Whereas in the Maine Constitution, it's Article 1, Section 16, and I'll read that off to you. To keep and bear arms, every citizen has the right. It mentions nothing about the militia. This is the reason why I like to use this here, is it shuts these people up that say, oh, that's only for the militia to carry firearms. In Maine here, what we say is that every citizen has the right to keep and bear arms, and this right shall never be questioned. Well, the U.S. Constitution was changed 27 times. How many people here know how many times this one was changed? 50, 100, 150, 176 times this Constitution was changed. In the U.S. Constitution, every change that was made, those 26 changes, they explain on the bottom when it was changed and why it was changed. They hide the fact when they changed the Maine Constitution. This section here was changed. It used to read, every citizen has a right to keep and bear arms for the common defense. I believe that's still in the Massachusetts Constitution. It's definitely in the Connecticut Constitution. But they took out of the Maine Constitution because they didn't want to give you the right to, and I know the people who were involved in this, and they're still in power in the legislature, but they didn't want to give you the right to keep and bear arms for the common defense because they're leftists. They don't want you to have a firearm. So what they did was they took that out on the premise that if that's left in there, that means you can't hunt. So they got the hunters in Maine and the National Rifle Association and the, oh, I forgot who the heck's the Sportsmen's Alliance to have that part removed from the Constitution so that it would better allow you to go hunting. And that's how they took that out of the Constitution. Very sneaky. I don't want to mention the person's name. But
What year was that, Jared? What year was that, Phil?
1976. That person lives right down the road from here. Anyway, I don't want to go too much further into the Constitution. You guys took your day off here. I could probably keep going for another 20 hours. But what I want you guys to know is, read that Constitution, understand it, make sure that your personal legislator knows it and understands it and uses it. That's the only way you're going to be able to stop these people from creating unconstitutional laws. I was making a discussion once in front of some legislators, and I had mentioned that of those 76 changes that were in the Constitution, half of them were unconstitutional. I wanted to create a group within the legislature, or some group that had enough power to start looking into these 176 changes, because if they're unconstitutional, that means they're repugnant. And if anybody understands where that word really became knowledgeable to legislators, it was in the 1800s, where you had a court case of Marbury versus Madison, and anything that's repugnant to the Constitution is null. And when something is that obvious, you don't even have to go to a court of law. I don't know how many times we've met with Governor LePage saying, you can stop something right now by considering it repugnant. The legislature could look at something and call it repugnant and end it right there. So I wanted to create this group in Augusta that would actually entertain the idea of looking at each one of these 176 changes. And if the changes were repugnant, we put them right back into the Constitution again, or change the statutes. Okay, yes, sir.
Hal said something yesterday, and which is, I think, the most scary sentence in government today: separation of church and state. Okay, the reason why they want separation of church and state, which is not even in the Constitution, we know that. It's just man-made because they took it from Thomas Jefferson, okay? And it was a letter to a church, but all of a sudden they made this law. The reason is because the whole Constitution, it talks about, what did you say a while ago? All reference to the Lord?
Yeah.
Okay? Now, when you separate the church, which the Lord is number one in, what else do you have? And what's happened is that there's a lot of atheist people that went in government, and they've been trying to separate that, especially socialist communists, because they don't believe in the Lord. Atheists. And that's been the destruction of our country. And we have to just go back, say the people, not only do they need to read the Constitution, they need to read the Bible. Because that's where the Constitution comes from.
Right. Well, let me read the preamble, and I think that'll be a little more clear. We, the people of Maine, in order to establish justice, ensure tranquility, provide for our mutual defense, promote our common welfare, secure to ourselves and our posterity the blessings of liberty. I wonder who's giving you the blessings there.
Charles Darwin.
Yes. Accordingly, with grateful hearts, the goodness of the sovereign ruler of the universe.
That's the General Secretary of the UN.
Yeah. Well, for some it might be Satan, who knows? But let me continue. The sovereign ruler of the universe, in affording us an opportunity so favorable to the design and imploring God's aid. Boy, 2 references, and I haven't even got out of the preamble yet. If we want to remove from church from state, these things got to go. But remember when I said when you take the oath is broken down into 2 parts, and both times it says, yes, sir.
Can you make the case that an atheist cannot take an oath and obey that Constitution?
Good point. As a matter of fact, I think one of the Muslims, maybe 2 Muslims in the Congress, did the oath on the Quran.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Something's wrong there, that person is not taking a proper oath. So to answer your question on that, no, there was a lot that went on with our founding fathers as to understanding who created this Constitution. Even though man did it, it was through the inspiration of God. But let me add one more thing. Where these people come up with the separation of church and state, England, if you'll remember, back Bloody Mary and Queen Elizabeth, during that era, they were trying to remove the Catholic Church in England. And France didn't want to do it, Spain didn't want to remove the Catholic Church. So what happened was England, even though they removed the Catholic Church from England, if you go to an English Protestant church, you're going to say, half the ceremonies here are Catholic. So in order to appease the people and not cut off the Catholic Church completely, what they did was they continued to use a lot of the ceremonies and the processes that went on in the Protestant church. They used the Catholic Church too. So when they came to this country here, they wanted nothing to do with the English church, which back then, if you didn't go to church, they frowned on you for not going to church, and they tried to force people to swear to the church in order to become a politician. So that's the reason why at that time they said, we're not going to have church and state anymore, we're going to have a separation of church and state. So that's where that came from.
No, Maine Massachusetts did have a state church up until about the 1820s. Did Maine have a state church?
Depends on what part of Maine. When you come up in this neighborhood here, you're talking about a very, very thick heritage of French in a lot of the Catholic churches.
No, but I mean officially. Did Maine officially recognize the
Not to
state?
my knowledge.
Okay.
I'd be lying to you if
Yeah.
I said yeah.
Okay.
But you go to the southern Maine and you don't find as many Catholic churches as you find up in this area here, and that's because of the French heritage there. But there's no church in this that's considered the Church of Maine. Anybody else have a question? Okay.
Well, thank you.
Take your knowledge, begin going to political meetings in your town, whether you're Democrat or Republican. You know what's right and wrong. I mean, we know the difference between black and white. We know the color of the sun. When we're at our meetings, our local meetings, if you hear anything that you don't understand, you don't like, or you know is wrong, speak up. This is the reason why our leaders in the Republican Party and the Democrat Party wind up controlling us, is that they say things and they make it so that you're embarrassed to speak up and say something's wrong. So what happens is these leaders wind up forcing you to vote for these people that they suggest. We send them into the swamp in Augusta, we send them into the swamp in Washington, and then the president comes along and says, let's drain the swamp. Well, where are you going to begin draining the swamp?
Right here.
Right here, right in your towns, right in your state, your county politics. So take that information and use it. Yes, dear.